the door swung open before Raymond could knock. That was the first sign that everything was wrong. Stop, subscribe first, then watch. Because once this story starts, you won't want to pause for anything, and you'll want more where this came from. Amara felt it in her chest, a cold, quick drop, like stepping off a curb in the dark and finding the ground wasn't where you expected it to be. She had been to difficult places before. She had sat in rooms thick with cigarette smoke and the sound of men talking over each other. Rooms where the furniture was cheap and the threats were not. She had learned early how to make herself invisible in rooms like those, to breathe shallow, to keep her eyes soft and unfocused, to hold every muscle completely still. A still girl drew less attention. A still girl survived. But this was not a room like those. The top-floor office smelled of cold air and expensive leather, and something underneath both of those things, something metallic and scrubbed clean that she didn't want to name. The carpet beneath her feet was the deep, dense black of a sea at night. The desk at the far end of the room was long and dark and polished to a mirror shine. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind it looked out over the whole of the city, and the city looked small from up here. Everything looked small from up here. The man behind the desk made it look smaller. He was seated when they walked in, which should have diminished him somehow. It didn't. He was lean in the way that very dangerous things were lean. Not thin, but stripped down. Not an ounce of anything that wasn't necessary. His suit was the color of midnight and fit him like it had been built on his body. His hair was immaculately dark. His hands were resting flat on the desk in front of him. Very still, very deliberate. And he was watching them both with eyes that were black and flat and gave away absolutely nothing. He had not said a word in 10 minutes. Raymond was making up for it. "She's a good girl, Mr. Kang." Raymond's voice had that particular pitch it got when he was afraid and trying to hide it. Too fast, too loud, the sentences stumbling over each other. Hard-working, reliable. She won't give you a moment's trouble, I promise you that. Very loyal. She's been trained to be. She knows how to keep a house. She's educated. She speaks well. She's everything a man in your position would want for a household. Amara kept her eyes on the floor. Stand straight, eyes down, don't speak unless spoken to. Be agreeable, be an asset. Those had been Raymond's instructions, delivered in the car on the way here, with his hand tight on the back of her neck. She had listened without reacting, the way she had trained herself to listen to him over 23 years. The way you listened to thunder when you already knew the storm was coming, and there was nowhere left to run. She was 23 years old, and she was being bartered. Not sold. Raymond had been very specific about that in his own head, she could tell. He called it an arrangement, a partnership. He said it like the word meant something, like wrapping an ugly thing in nicer paper changed what was underneath. She was the final card in a hand he had already lost, the last thing he owned that had any value. And he was spending her like he had spent everything else, carelessly, desperately, without a single backward look at what it cost her. She did not look at her father. She did not look at the man behind the desk. She looked at the carpet and she breathed and she waited. The silence that fell when Raymond finally ran out of words was enormous. It pressed against the walls of the room. It had weight and temperature, and it smelled like the moment before something breaks. Then Kang Jiseo leaned forward. It was a small movement, barely a shift, just the slight tilt of his body toward the desk, but it silenced Raymond as completely as if someone had cut a wire. His hands came together, fingers steepled, elbows resting on the polished surface. He looked at Raymond for a long, careful moment, and then his gaze moved. It moved to her. Amara felt it land. She kept her eyes down, but she felt it the way you felt a light turning on in a dark room. A sudden awareness, a change in the quality of the air. She felt him looking at the scar near her temple, that her makeup never quite covered. She felt him taking in the rigid set of her shoulders and the way her hands were balled into fists at her sides. She felt, somehow, that he was reading her the way she had learned to read rooms. Quickly, completely, missing nothing. She lifted her eyes for one single second, just one. She met his gaze, and in that fraction of a moment she looked for cruelty and didn't find it. She looked for hunger and didn't find that, either. What she found was something that unsettled her more than either of those things would have. An emptiness so complete. It looked like a room that had been cleared of all its furniture. Like a man who had decided long ago that feeling things was a luxury he couldn't afford. She dropped her gaze back to the floor. Her heart was hammering. "You brought your daughter here," Kang Jiseo said, "to settle your account." His voice was low and even and stripped of any accent, like a sentence with all the edges filed off. Raymond exhaled with relief. Yes, a permanent arrangement. A marriage, there is no arrangement. The words weren't loud, they didn't need to be. There is your debt, and your pathetic attempt to pay it. The temperature in the room dropped. Raymond's face crumpled and then rearranged itself, desperately trying to find a new angle. Mr. Kang, if you'd just, she's everything I have left. Kang Jiseo rose from his chair. It was a single fluid motion, no wasted energy, no hesitation, the way water moved downhill. He walked around the desk, not toward Amara but toward her father, and when he stopped in front of Raymond, the older man seemed to shrink 3 inches on the spot. Kang was taller, leaner. But it wasn't the physical difference that made Raymond small. It was something else. Something in the way he stood in a room like it already belonged to him. He looked down at Raymond with an expression that was worse than contempt, because it was so completely disinterested. You value your child so little, he said quietly, that you would trade her for your own worthless life. Raymond's mouth opened, closed. She's all I have left to offer, he whispered. Kang Jiseo looked at him for one more moment. Get out. Raymond stared. But the deal, he is no longer your concern. The words were spoken to her, and they were judgment and dismissal and severance all at once. Then Kang turned back to her father, and his voice dropped to something just above a whisper, something so quiet it was almost gentle, which made it the most frightening thing she had ever heard in her life. I said get out, do not contact her. Do not come within a mile of any property with my name attached to it. Do not speak her name. If you do, I will remove your tongue myself with my hands. Do you understand me? Raymond understood. He understood so thoroughly that he knocked his chair over, scrambling to his feet. He gave Amara one last look, not concern, not apology, just wide-eyed bewilderment, like he hadn't quite planned for this outcome, and then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him with a sound like a full stop at the end of a sentence. Silence. Amara stood perfectly still, her script was gone. Every scenario she had mentally rehearsed on the drive here. Submission, compliance, endurance, the long, slow process of surviving whatever came next, had just been crumpled up and thrown out a window. She had no map for this, she had no language for this. She stood in the middle of this cold, expensive room, and waited for the other shoe. She heard him move, heard his footsteps cross the carpet, even and unhurried. He came back around behind his desk, but he didn't sit. He leaned against it instead, arms crossed loosely, watching her. He will not bother you again, he said. The quiet certainty in those words was so absolute that she felt something crack open in her chest. Not hope exactly, but the outline of where hope might fit if she let it. What do you want from me? Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. She looked up, finally, fully, because she needed to see his face when he answered. She needed to know what shape this new cage was. Tell me the truth. What is it you actually want? He looked at her for a long moment. His expression didn't change, exactly, but something in it shifted, like light moving across water. For now, he said slowly, I want you to breathe. He gestured toward a side door she hadn't noticed. My driver will take you to my residence. You will have your own rooms, your own space. You will be safe there. Safe. The word landed differently than it should have. She had heard that word before, used it sometimes, right before something terrible, and it had learned to mean the opposite of itself in her experience. Safety was a door she could never find the key to. Safety was a promise that expired the moment it was made. She didn't move. Why? She asked. Just that. One word, all the weight of 23 years behind it. He didn't flinch from it. Because my business is with men who make foolish wagers, he said. Not with their daughters. He straightened then, his professional mask sliding back into place like a visor dropping. Dinner is at 8, I will see you there. A brief nod, precise as a period. He turned to the papers on his desk and did not look up again. She was being dismissed. Not into a cell, not into a punishment, into a life she had no framework for understanding. She walked to the side door on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The penthouse was made of glass and light and silence. Amara stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in the suite they had given her. The suite, not the room, because a room was what you called it when it had one purpose and this space had 4. And she watched the Lego skyline burn gold and orange as the sun went down. The bedroom behind her had a bed so deep and white it looked like a cloud. The bathroom had marble floors and a mirror the size of a wall. The sitting room had 2 armchairs and a side table, and a stack of books someone had placed there. And she didn't know if that was intentional or incidental. And she didn't know which would be more unsettling. Clothes had been laid out on the bed, simple things. Soft fabrics, muted colors, cream and sage in the gray of early morning. Nothing designed to display her. Nothing that told her what she was for. She had stood in this room for 2 hours now, waiting. The knock came at exactly 8 o'clock. She tensed, her whole body going rigid with old reflex, and then she breathed and she walked to the door and she opened it. It was Mrs. Nwasu, the older woman who had shown her to the suite, gray-haired and watchful. With the careful composure of someone who had worked in dangerous households, long enough to master the art of noticing everything and revealing nothing. "Mr. Kang is waiting for you in the dining room, Miss Amara." Miss Amara, not the girl, not the payment, not her name, just her name. She followed Mrs. Nwasu down a corridor, lined with artwork she didn't have words for, and into a dining room that could have seated 20 people. It was set for 2. He was already there, standing when she entered. He had changed from the midnight suit into a simple black sweater and dark trousers. Different. Less like a thing from another world. More like a man who had come home. He pulled out her chair. She sat, they ate. The food was extraordinary, and she tasted almost none of it. She was watching him, cataloging him, running the algorithm she had developed over years of living with Raymond. Trying to find the threat hiding inside the kindness. Trying to calculate when the performance would end and the real thing would begin. "Is the food to your liking?" he asked, cutting through the quiet clink of silverware. She startled slightly. "Yes, it's very good. Thank you. If you have preferences, tell the cook." Preferences. The concept arrived in her mind like a word in a foreign language. She understood it technically but couldn't access it emotionally. She had spent so long making herself small, taking whatever was left over, asking for nothing, because asking led to worse outcomes. "I don't have any," she said automatically. Something moved across his face. He didn't comment on it. "There is a library," he said instead, his tone shifting to something almost careful. "A media room. An art studio, if that interests you." She stared at him. He was offering her things to do, as if she were a guest. "What are the rules?" she asked bluntly. He set his fork down. Gave her his full attention. "You are not to leave the building without my knowledge. For now, that is not a punishment. It is a practical reality. My enemies do not distinguish between principals and people who live under my roof." He held her gaze steadily. "You will be treated with complete respect by my staff. If anyone fails in that, you tell me." He paused, and his voice shifted again, becoming, if anything, quieter. "You will not be expected to do anything that makes you uncomfortable. This is not a transaction, Amara." He said her name, and it was nothing like the way Raymond had ever said it. No edge to it, no ownership, just a name, just hers. "This is a sanctuary." She felt the tear before she understood it was coming. It slid down her cheek, and she caught it furiously with the back of her hand, humiliated by the involuntary honesty of it. He looked down at his plate and continued eating. He gave her the space to put herself back together without making her feel the shame of having come apart, and that small, precise act of consideration lodged itself somewhere deep in her chest like a splinter made of light. She didn't sleep that first night. She lay in the cloud-white bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the city below and thought about the word sanctuary and what it would mean if it turned out to be true. She didn't let herself believe it yet, but she kept the thought close. Like a match you weren't sure you'd need, but couldn't bring yourself to throw away. 3 weeks passed before she stopped waiting for it to go wrong. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way dawn happened. So gradually you couldn't point to the exact moment the dark became light. You just looked up one morning and realized the darkness was gone. She woke up on the 22nd day and noticed, with a kind of cautious bewilderment, that her shoulders weren't tight, that she had slept through the night, that she had reached for a book from the library shelf, without first calculating whether wanting something would cost her later. She was reading everything. She moved through the library shelves the way a person who had been kept from water moved through a river, recklessly, gratefully, pausing to stand still in the middle of it, just to feel it all around her. Botany textbooks she had dog-eared the corners of in university before Raymond's debts pulled her out. Novels she had borrowed from friends and never had the peace to finish. Historical narratives. Biographies of women who had built things with their hands and their minds and refused to be reduced to what men wanted them to be. She also found the art studio. She stood in the doorway the first time for a full 10 minutes before she walked in. Charcoal pencils in a ceramic cup, clean white paper in careful stacks. Paint she wasn't sure she remembered how to use. She picked up a pencil and stood in front of the paper, and for a long moment her hand didn't move. The last time she had drawn anything she was 16 years old, and Raymond had found her sketchbook and called it a waste of time and thrown it in the bin, and she had never drawn again Because it was easier not to want things he could take from her. The pencil moved. It was clumsy at first. The lines weren't what she intended them to be. But then something unlocked somewhere deep in her muscle memory. In the part of herself she had walled off so long ago, it had almost convinced her it wasn't there. And the lines became shapes. And the shapes became a face, and the face was her own, and she stared at it and felt something fierce and fragile move through her like a current. She drew for 3 hours. She didn't tell him about it. Kang Jiseo left early every morning. 6:30, sometimes earlier, his black car pulling out of the underground garage before the city had fully woken up. He returned late most nights, and she could tell the quality of the day he'd had by the way he moved when he came through the door. On good days, his footsteps were even and measured, his posture neutral. On harder days, there was a tension in the line of his shoulders, a tightness around his jaw that he wore like armor that had started to get heavy. He never brought it into the room with words. He was not a man who explained himself. But she noticed. She noticed the way he favored his left side Tuesday evenings. Some old injury that flared up on the days he spent in meetings rather than moving. She noticed he didn't drink anything but water and black tea. That he ate sparingly, that he read for exactly 40 minutes before bed every night. She had seen the light under his office door. She noticed that when he laughed, which was rare, it transformed his face so completely it was almost alarming, like watching a landscape change during lightning. She started leaving tea for him. It was a small thing, an almost nothing thing. She would hear his car arrive through the specific frequency of the building's quiet, and she would put the kettle on and brew the calming blend she had found in the kitchen. Chamomile and ginger, and something smoky she couldn't identify, and leave a cup on the small table near the entrance of the living area. And then she would go back to her book or her sketchpad or her plants and say nothing about it. The first time, he stopped walking when he saw it. She was watching from behind the rim of her own cup, pretending to read, and she saw him pause, just for a second, and look at the cup and then look toward the corridor where she was. Something moved across his face that she didn't have a name for yet. He picked up the cup. He nodded once in her direction. She looked back at her book. The next evening she left it again. And the evening after that. They never spoke about it. It became part of the rhythm of their days. Unacknowledged, understood. A small thread of care woven between them without ceremony. The garden came without warning. She had mentioned botany to him exactly once in passing, over dinner on the 9th night. He had asked what she had studied before she stopped studying, and she had said it before she thought about whether to botany, urban horticulture. I wanted to work on city greening projects, community gardens, and then caught herself and changed the subject because wanting things in front of people made her feel exposed. He hadn't responded much, just listened, nodded once, let the conversation move. She forgot she had said it. Then one morning, she came out of her bedroom, and there were workmen in the living area. She froze in the corridor, every alarm in her body firing simultaneously. And then she saw Mrs. Nwosu standing calmly near the window, directing the placement of large ceramic planters. And the men were installing irrigation tubing along the walls. And there were crates near the door, sealed wooden crates that smelled of green and damp and growing things even through the wood. What is Amara started? Mr. Kang's instructions, Mrs. Nwosu said simply. He thought this room could use more life. The plants arrived throughout the afternoon. Rare orchids, their petals like something painted by hand, delicate cascading ferns. Lush tropical varieties she had only ever seen in textbooks and botanical garden pamphlets, things she had circled tinsel in her university books, and never imagined she would touch in real life. By evening, the corner of the living space had been transformed into something that looked like a conservatory had simply decided to exist there, green and breathing and luminous in the late light. When Kang Jiseo came home that night, she was standing in the middle of it with both hands pressed over her mouth. He walked in, looked at the space, and then looked at her. His expression was completely neutral. I thought the room could use more life, he said again, exactly as Mrs. Nwosu had said it, as if that were all there was to say about it. Then he walked past toward his office. She stood there for a long time after he left. No one had ever done anything like that for her, not once, not in 23 years. The gifts she had received in her life had always been conditional, always had a price tag written in invisible ink that she only discovered later. But this, he hadn't handed it to her and waited for gratitude. He hadn't used it to establish debt. He had just made it happen. Put green, living, growing things in her space because she had mentioned once that she loved them. She pressed her hands harder against her mouth and breathed. Then she went and found her sketch pad and sat among the ferns and the orchids, and drew until the light failed and Mrs. Nwosu came to tell her dinner was ready. From that night on, the conservatory corner was hers. She spent most of her days there, her hands in the soil, her mind quiet in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. The plants became a project, and then a practice, and then a kind of prayer. Something she tended and watched and trusted to grow without forcing it. She didn't realize for a while that she was doing the same thing with him. 6 weeks in, on a night when the Lagos heat had finally broken into something cooler, something close to bearable, she was up on a step stool trying to redirect a climbing vine along its trellis. She had grown ambitious with the installation, added a second trellis higher up, started training the vine into an arch. And the top of the arch was just past what she could comfortably reach. She stretched, the stool wobbled. She made a sound, not quite a cry, more a gasp. And then the world tilted and she was falling, and then she wasn't. His arms caught her around the waist and pulled her back and against his chest in one motion. And it was so fast and so total that for a full second, her nervous system didn't know how to process it. She was pressed against him, her back to his front, his arms wrapped firm and sure around her, and her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she was certain he could feel it. She felt him breathe, steady, strong. His heartbeat was even against her shoulder blades. "Are you all right?" His voice was low and very close to her ear, and something about the combination of the warmth of him and the specific timbre of his voice in that proximity did something to the air in her lungs. She turned her head slightly, just slightly. Her cheek barely grazed the fabric of his sweater, soft, warm, smelling of sandalwood and clean linen, and their faces were suddenly very close together. His chin was near her temple. She could feel the faint warmth of his breath. She turned a fraction more. He hadn't moved. He was looking at her, and his eyes, those flat, unreadable, carefully empty eyes, were neither flat nor empty. There was something in them that she had never seen there before, something concentrated and careful and raw. His gaze moved, just once, to her lips, and then back to her eyes, and the air between them became something solid, something she could have pressed her hand against. She was not afraid. That was the thing that surprised her most. She was not afraid. She was standing in the arms of the most dangerous man she had ever been within 10 feet of, and every nerve in her body was awake and alert, and she was not afraid. "I'm fine," she managed. His grip didn't loosen immediately. His hands were at her waist, her back still against his chest, and for 3 more seconds, she counted them without meaning to. Neither of them moved. Then he set her carefully back on her feet. His hands lingered on her arms for just a moment longer than the situation required. She felt each finger. She felt the exact moment he let go. "Be more careful," he said. His voice was not quite steady. He stepped back. He picked up the book he had left on the side table. He sat down in the armchair by the window and opened it and did not look at her. She turned back to her vine and pretended to adjust the trellis for several minutes, her hands not entirely steady either. Something had shifted. She could feel the new shape of the room, the changed air between them, charged and humming with everything neither of them had said. The wall he maintained around himself, the careful, measured distance he had kept since the first night, had developed a crack in it. She didn't push on it, but she stopped being afraid of what might be on the other side. She found out later, from Mrs. Nwosu, who said things with her eyes long before she said them with her mouth, that he had turned down 3 separate invitations to events that week to stay at the penthouse, that he had rescheduled an overseas meeting twice, that his second-in-command, a severe and efficient man named Mr. Bake, had twice sent messages asking when the boss intended to return to his downtown office for full operational days. She stored this information quietly. She didn't know yet what to do with it. What she knew was this: that she had started sleeping through the night, that she had started eating without calculating whether she deserved it, that she had started answering Mrs. Nwosu's questions with actual opinions instead of reflexive compliance. "Yes, I'd prefer the orchids by the east window. Yes, I think the dining room would look warmer with lighter curtains. Yes, thank you, I do have a preference." She was learning the shape of her own preferences, slowly, like a person learning to walk again after a long time of keeping still. She was learning the shape of him too. And the more she learned, the more the thing she had initially called not being afraid started to reveal itself as something else entirely. Something that lived lower in her chest. Something that made her ridiculously aware of the exact chair he sat in every evening, of the precise frequency of his laugh, of the way he said her name, Amara, like it was something he had decided mattered. She didn't name it yet. She wasn't ready to name it yet. but she let it stay. The morning the letter arrived, she was in the conservatory. It was a Tuesday, and the rain had come in the night and left everything outside washed and gleaming. And she had been up since 6, hands in the soil, talking quietly to a young orchid that she had been coaxing out of shock since she repotted it 2 weeks ago. She told it that the difficulty of being moved to a new place didn't mean the new place wasn't good for it. She had a feeling they understood each other. Mrs. Nwosu knocked on the conservatory door. Her face was carefully arranged in its usual composure, but Amara had learned to read the things Mrs. Nwosu's composure was arranged to hide, and what she saw underneath it now made her go still. "This was left at the front desk for you, Miss Amara." The package was small. Nondescript brown paper, her name written on it in handwriting she recognized from 23 years of living beneath it. Raymond. She didn't open it right away. She held it in both hands and looked at it, and felt the cold crawl up from her stomach into her chest. The old sensation. The one she had almost convinced herself was behind her, flooding back like a tide. She set it on the workbench. She looked at it for a full minute. Then she opened it. Inside was a single rose, black and wilted, petals already falling. And beneath it, a folded note in Raymond's spidery handwriting. The letters slightly too large, the pressure on the page slightly too hard. The way he always wrote when he was trying to be frightening. "He can't keep you locked up forever. You still owe me." The conservatory went very quiet around her. She was aware distantly of the rain starting again outside, soft and steady against the glass. She was aware of the orchid she had been tending, its single white bloom, its patient green leaves. She was aware of her own hands, which were very cold, and the note still held between them, and the way the walls of the room seemed to be getting closer. She had not heard from Raymond in 6 weeks. She had let herself believe, almost, that Kang's threat had been enough, that the one warning had held, that the man who had shaped 23 years of fear had somehow finally found the limit of his reach. She had been wrong to believe that. She stood in her conservatory, her plants, her soil, her hard-won small safety, and she held a dead black rose and a note that said she could not keep what she had built, and she felt the cage of her old life closing around her again like a hand. She did not hear him arrive. She only knew he was home when she looked up, and he was in the doorway of the conservatory, suit jacket over one arm, and he took one look at her face. Just one, and everything about him changed. The calm, even, contained man she had come to know across 6 weeks of quiet evenings and careful conversations went somewhere else. What replaced it was something she hadn't seen in him before. Something that lived below the professional surface, below the controlled exterior. Something cold and still and absolute, in the way that deep water was cold and still and absolute. Something that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with what he actually was. "What is it?" he said. Not a question, a demand stripped down to its essential form. She couldn't speak. She held out the note. He crossed the room in 4 steps and took it from her hand. He read it. She watched his face as he did, watched the muscles in his jaw tighten, watched his expression turn to something carved from stone. And then he took out his phone and made a call. The language was Korean, rapid and low, and she didn't understand a single word of it. But she understood the tone. She had heard men use that tone before, always in the moments just before something became irrevocable. He hung up. He looked at her, his dark eyes moving across her face, measuring something. "He found you," she whispered. "He will not get near you." The words were a wall. "I give you my word." He was so close to her now, barely 2 feet of charged air between them. And he didn't touch her, but his nearness was itself a kind of contact. The particular gravity of a person who had decided, with absolute certainty, that something was under their protection. "I will handle this," he said. "Tonight. He will not be a threat to you after tonight." He left within minutes, Mr. Bake, appearing from somewhere with 2 other men she recognized as part of the inner circle, and she watched from the window as the black car moved out into the rain-soaked dark, and she stood there for a long time after its lights disappeared. She went back to her orchid. She tended it for hours, her hands moving on habit while her mind ran in circles, while the rain came down and the city's lights blurred through the wet glass, and somewhere in the dark, Raymond was about to meet the only person in the world more dangerous than the fear he had built in her. She told herself she didn't know what was going to happen. She told herself she didn't know how she felt about it. Both of those things were lies, and she sat with them in the green and growing quiet of her conservatory, until the sky outside began to change color at its lowest edge, the deep black of the night going to indigo, and then to the bruised purple of a sky that had used up all its dark. She heard the elevator. She heard footsteps she recognized. She turned. He looked tired. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the slight rumpling of his suit, not the careful way he held his left arm, not the small dark stain on the white cuff that she made herself not look at directly. Just the tiredness. It sat on him differently than she had ever seen anything sit on him before. He was a man who moved through the world like he had already calculated every variable and found them all manageable. Tonight he moved like the calculation had cost him something. He came to stand beside her in the conservatory. He didn't announce himself. He didn't explain. He stood next to her workbench in the green and breathing quiet of the room, the grow lights casting everything in a soft amber warmth, the smell of jasmine that had bloomed overnight filling the air between them. He looked at the orchid she had been tending all night. He looked at her hands, still faintly dark at the knuckles from the soil. Then he looked at her face. "It's over," he said softly. "He's gone. He will not be coming back." The word ever wasn't spoken. It didn't need to be. It lived inside the silence that followed those two sentences, enormous and final, settling into the room like something that had always been true and had only just been confirmed. Amara stood very still. She understood what he was telling her. She understood what gone meant in the language of the world he operated in, and she understood that she should feel something clean and uncomplicated about that. Horror, or grief, or the particular cold of knowing an act of violence had been committed on her behalf. She reached for those feelings. She found them distantly like objects seen through thick glass. But the larger thing, the thing that lived closer to the surface, the thing that rushed up through her chest with the force of water that had been held back too long, was release. 23 years of it. 23 years of bracing for a knock on the door, of monitoring the specific temperature of a room, before deciding how much space she was allowed to take up, of calibrating every action against the potential cost of Raymond's reaction. 23 years of learning to be small and quiet and undemanding, of understanding that her wants were liabilities, her feelings were provocations, her existence was a resource to be drawn down. And now he was gone. The spring of it, the tightly wound coil of permanent low-grade terror she had carried in her body. For so long she had stopped feeling it as a separate thing and started feeling it as herself. Slowly, with a physical sensation she hadn't anticipated, began to uncoil. She looked up at Kang Jaseo. He was just watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Something unguarded. Something that didn't have the usual layers of control over it. Tired, yes. But beneath the tiredness something else. Something careful and searching, like a man who had done a terrible thing and was waiting to find out if it had been the right one. "Thank you," she whispered. The words felt completely inadequate. They were completely inadequate. But they were the only words she had for something that had no real language, for what it meant to have someone decide, without qualification or condition, that you were worth protecting. He nodded once, his gaze held hers. And in that held look, in the conservatory that smelled of jasmine and wet earth, with the city going pale and golden outside the glass, something moved between them. Not spoken, not acted on, not yet. But undeniable, the way gravity was undeniable, the way the fact of dawn was undeniable even while it was still happening. He looked away first. "Get some sleep," he said quietly. He turned and left the conservatory, and she heard his office door close down the hall, and she stood among her plants for a long time after. She thought about the word gone. She thought about what it had cost her to feel relief. She thought about a man who had chosen to carry that cost so she wouldn't have to. She pressed her fingers into the soil of the orchid pot, cool and dark and solid and real, and she breathed, and for the first time in 23 years she breathed without armor. After that, everything was different, not loudly different, not in the way of grand announcements or dramatic declarations. Differently the way seasons changed. You looked up one day, and the light was sitting on everything at a different angle, and you couldn't say exactly when it had shifted, only that it had. He started coming home earlier. Not every day, but often enough that she began to recalibrate her internal clock around it. Began to feel, in the late afternoons, a particular quality of anticipation she didn't examine too closely. He would appear in the doorway of the conservatory sometimes and just stand there, watching her work, not speaking, not demanding anything. Just present, in the way that certain kinds of company were their own kind of rest. She would say, without looking up, "The jasmine is taking over the east trellis," and he would say, "Let it," and that would be enough. That would be its own complete thing. He started working from the penthouse more often, his office door open instead of closed, and she would hear the low cadence of his voice on calls and find herself tracking it the way you tracked a weather. Not anxiously, just as information about the atmosphere of the place she was in. Sometimes she brought his coffee without him asking. Sometimes he appeared in the doorway of whatever room she was in with a book he had pulled from the library shelf and placed wordlessly on the table beside her. And she would look at the title and then look at him. And there would be the ghost of something on his face that on a different man she would have called shy. She read every book. She left notes in the margins sometimes, small comments and questions, and she started finding notes written back. His handwriting small and very precise, never more than a sentence, sometimes just a word. Agreed, or wrong, and here's why. Or once, beside a passage, she had underlined about the way plants communicated through root systems, sharing nutrients across distances with strangers. Just a small check mark, deliberate and private, that felt like the most intimate thing she had ever been given. One evening, she looked up from her workbench and found him crouched on the floor beside her lowest planter, turning a pot of struggling ferns in his hands, examining the roots with a focused attention that made her chest do something complicated. "The drainage is wrong," he said without looking up. "I know," she said. "I'm working on it. There's a deeper tray in the supply closet. Third shelf." He set the pot down carefully. "I ordered it when the irrigation system was installed. Thought it might be useful." She stared at him. "You researched drainage trays?" He stood, brushing his hands together, his expression entirely neutral. "I have people who research things." She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. "Of course you do." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Almost a smile. She turned back to her workbench so he wouldn't see her face. The attack came on a Thursday morning, which was somehow the most wrong thing about it. Threats, in Amara's limited understanding of Kang Jiseo's world, were things that arrived in the dark, in the deep hours, in the rain. Not in bright, ordinary daylight, when she was wearing a soft cream cardigan and thinking about whether the night-blooming Sirius was ready to repot. But the world of dangerous men, she was learning, did not arrange itself for dramatic effect. They were in the underground garage beneath the building, about to get into his armored car for a rare trip. He had told her the previous evening that there was a private gallery opening, a collection of botanical watercolors he thought she might want to see, framed as a statement of fact the way he framed all his rare offerings. Nothing so vulnerable as an invitation, just information left in the room for her to do with as she liked. She had said she wanted to go. She was wearing flat shoes and her good earrings and had spent 20 minutes trying to arrange her braids in a way that looked intentional rather than anxious. Mr. Bake was already in the garage. The driver was checking the car. The two vehicles came around the corner so fast, there was no warning sound before they were simply there. Headlights filling the underground space, tires screaming, men in dark clothing pouring out before the cars had fully stopped, weapons raised, voices shouting overlapping commands. Amara's mind went completely white. Then Kang Jiseo's hand was on her arm, firm and decisive, and she was being moved, not dragged but guided with absolute authority, toward a thick Crete pillar, and his voice was at her ear, low and steady, and cutting through everything else in the space, like a frequency nothing could interfere with. "Stay behind this, do not move, do not look." Then he was gone from beside her. She pressed her back against the concrete and her heart was slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. And the garage filled with noise. Shouts and the crack of gunfire, deafening in the enclosed space, sounds she had no reference for, sounds that didn't sound like the movies or the television because they were real and they were happening 6 feet away from her body, and the concrete at her back was the only solid thing in the world. She looked anyway, she couldn't not. She saw him moving through the chaos with a terrifying liquid precision. Not the frantic motion of panic, but something calculated and efficient and utterly without hesitation. He was a different person than the man who researched drainage trays and left check marks in the margins of books. He was something much older than that person, something that had been forged in conditions she would never fully understand, and it was both the most frightening thing she had ever witnessed, and somehow, underneath the fear, something that registered in her body as safety, because it was directed outward, because she was behind him. When the silence fell, it fell completely. The ringing in her ears was enormous. He came to her immediately, crossing the space in long strides, and he crouched down in front of her. She had slid down the pillar at some point without noticing, her knees against the concrete, and his hands came to her face, both of them, his palms against her cheeks, his eyes moving rapidly over her features, her neck, her arms. Amara. Her name in his mouth urgent and stripped bare. Are you hurt? Tell me right now. Are you hurt? She shook her head. Her voice wasn't available. His thumbs moved across her cheekbones. She realized distantly that her face was wet, that she had been crying without knowing it, and he was brushing the tears away with careful, deliberate gentleness. This man who had just been something else entirely. This man who shifted between registers so completely. She sometimes wondered which one was the true one, and then always arrived at the same answer, which was that they both were, which was the most frightening and the most true thing she knew about him. I'm okay, she managed finally. Her voice sounded far away. I'm okay. You're? She looked at his arm. There was a graze along his forearm, a thin, bright line of red against his skin where something had caught him. You're bleeding. He looked down at it as though noticing it for the first time. It's nothing. It's not nothing. She pushed herself upright on slightly unsteady legs. Come upstairs. She cleaned the wound at the kitchen counter while he sat on a stool and watched her with an expression she had learned to read by now. The specific configuration of his face when he was allowing something, without quite being able to explain to himself why he was allowing it. His jacket was off, his shirt sleeve rolled to the elbow, and the graze was clean but long, and her hands were steadier than she expected them to be. As she pressed the antiseptic cotton along the line of it, he didn't flinch. They thought you were weak, she said quietly, not looking up from his arm. Because of me. Because you've been spending more time here. A silence. Yes, he said. They thought having me here made you less. She paused. Focused, she looked up then, meeting his eyes. He was watching her with an openness she had never seen on him before, the professional mask entirely absent, and his face was just his face. Not the crime lord face. Not the controlled, deliberate, nothing touches me face. Just the face of a man who was very tired and had just fought his way back to a room where someone was cleaning his wounds, and the least frightening thing in his world was the woman standing in front of him. Are you? She asked softly. The question came out before she could decide whether to ask it. Less focused because of me. The silence this time was different. Full rather than empty. No, he said. His voice was rough in a way it almost never was. I am more dangerous. He held her gaze without wavering. Because now I have something to lose. The confession moved through the room like a change in air pressure. She understood what it cost a man like him to say that. She understood that for someone who had built an entire empire on the principle of having no vulnerabilities, no attachments, nothing the world could use as leverage against him. Admitting to something to lose was not a small thing. It was a dismantling. It was a door opening in a wall he had spent years making solid. She set the antiseptic down. She looked at him. This man of terrifying capability and unexpected gentleness, this man who built sky gardens and left checkmarks in book margins and had just told her, in the only language he seemed to have for it, that she mattered to him in the most dangerous way possible. Then I suppose, she said quietly. That makes two of us. Something in his face went very still. She turned away, putting the first aid supplies back in order, giving him space to absorb it, giving herself space to absorb having said it. Her hands were not quite as steady now as they had been a moment ago. Neither of them spoke again for a long time. But the room between them had changed shape, and they both knew it. That night, neither of them slept. She knew this because she was awake in her room until well past 2 in the morning, lying on her back, watching the ceiling, listening to the distant city below, and the closer, quieter sounds of the penthouse. And at some point she got up, because lying still with a mind that loud was its own kind of suffering. And she went to the window in the sitting room. He was already there. He was standing at the floor-to-ceiling glass, his back to the room, looking out at the city lights spread below them like something spilled and beautiful. He had changed into a dark shirt, untucked. He was barefoot. He looked, more than she had ever seen him look, like a person rather than a function. She came to stand beside him. He didn't turn, but she saw his shoulders shift slightly. The small, barely perceptible recalibration of a man who was intensely aware of her presence and had stopped pretending he wasn't. I never intended for you to be part of this, he said. His voice was low, directed at the city rather than at her. The violence, the danger. None of it. I know, she said. You didn't choose any of this. He turned his head then, looking at her profile in the dark, in the low, ambient glow of the city below them. Your father chose. I made decisions. You were given no vote. No, she agreed. She turned to face him. I didn't choose the way I got here. She held his gaze. But I'd choose to stay. The words landed between them like something irreversible. He looked at her for a long moment, a look that took her apart carefully and put her back together with something like reverence. And then he took one slow step toward her. Then, another. He moved the way he did everything, with deliberate, measured intention, giving her every moment to step back, to change her mind, to rebuild the careful distance they had maintained. She didn't move. She stood her ground, her heart loud in her chest, her hands still at her sides, and she watched him come to her. He raised his hand. He touched her face. His fingers cool and careful against her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw so lightly it was barely there. The scar near her temple, her sharp cheekbones, the curve of her jaw. He touched her, like she was something he was learning through his hands, something he had been meaning to understand for a very long time. "You have brought a quiet to my worlds," he said, his voice barely above a murmur, "that I didn't know was missing." His eyes moved across her face, her features, returning always to her eyes. "You made this place a home. I didn't know it wasn't one until you were in it." Her throat tightened. "You made me feel safe," she whispered back. And then she watched something shift in his face. The last thing, the final held thing, the thing he had been keeping on the other side of the wall, moved forward into the open. He leaned toward her slowly, giving her all the time in the world. And she closed the remaining distance herself, and the first touch of his lips against hers was so careful, so impossibly gentle, that it felt like a question asked in the quietest possible voice. She answered it. She leaned into him, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady hammer of his heart beneath her palm. Not so steady after all, not so controlled after all. And the kiss deepened, and it was not about passion, or urgency, or the months of charged proximity finding a physical outlet. It was about recognition, about two people who had spent their entire lives being unseen, finally being seen, about the particular relief of being known. When they broke apart, their foreheads rested together. Both of them were breathing unsteadily. The city glittered below them, indifferent and gorgeous. "Amara," he said softly. "Just that." "I know," she said, and she did. "Please, if you have gotten this far, comment where you're watching this from, and subscribe to support the channel, duration of their lives." No announcement. No morning where everything was suddenly and loudly different. It happened the way everything between them had happened. Quietly, incrementally, with the particular grace of two people who had both been hurt enough to understand that real things were built slowly, and that rushing something fragile was how you broke it before it had the chance to become strong. He held her hand the first time 3 days later. They were watching a film in the media room. Something she had chosen. Something with no violence in it. Something that moved slowly, and was mostly about light and landscape, and the way people talked to each other when they were afraid to say the real thing. And somewhere in the middle of it, his hand found hers on the armrest between them. Not reaching, not grasping, just arriving. The way the tide arrived, as if it had always been heading there. She turned her palm up, he laced his fingers through hers. Neither of them looked away from the screen. She read to him in the evenings now. It had started accidentally. She had been reading aloud to herself, a habit from childhood she had suppressed along with everything else. Working through a passage in a history of West African trade routes that she found genuinely extraordinary. And she had said without thinking, "Listen to this," and read him a paragraph. And he had set down his own book and listened with his full attention. And when she finished, he had said, "Keep going." And she had kept going for 2 hours. Now it was theirs. Their ritual, unglamorous and unhurried. Her voice and his listening. The city doing whatever it did outside glass while they stayed inside their quiet. He began to share things with her too. Not the violence. Never the violence. And she never asked for it. Understood instinctively that the life he lived in those hours was something she could acknowledge without needing to inhabit. But the strategy of it. The architecture of power. The complex and constantly shifting web of alliances and loyalties and pressure points that kept his world in its particular balance. He would sit across from her in the conservatory in the evenings and lay out a problem the way you laid out a map, and she would look at it with the same careful attention she gave to her plants, tracing the root systems, identifying what was starved and what were rough, asking the questions that cut straight to the thing beneath the thing. He listened to her answers. More than listened. He acted on them twice that she knew about, restructuring an alliance that had been quietly rotting from the inside. Redirecting resources toward a sector of his legitimate business that she had identified as underleveraged. He never announced that he had taken her advice. She noticed anyway. She always noticed. She opened up too. Slowly, in pieces, the way you removed bandaging from a wound you weren't sure had healed, carefully, watching for the signal to stop. She told him about her mother, who had died when she was 9 and left her alone in a house with Raymond, and no buffer between his worst self and her smallest self. She told him about the sketchbooks, about the botany degree she had been 1 semester from completing, about the community garden project she had designed in her 3rd year, fully mapped, budgeted, scoped, that she had never submitted because Raymond had needed money the week it was due and she had spent the following 6 months working double shifts to cover what he had taken. Kang Jiseo listened to all of it. He didn't soften his expression into pity. He didn't offer platitudes or the particular kind of sympathy that was really just discomfort wearing a compassionate face. He listened the way he did everything, with absolute attention, with the specific respect of a person who understood that being heard accurately was rarer and more valuable than being comforted cheaply. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then, tell me more about the garden project. She blinked. The community one? From university? Yes. He was looking at her steadily. The design, the budget. What neighborhoods you had identified, she told him. She told him more than she had told anyone. The full scope of it. The vision she had carried quietly for years. The conviction that cities grew healthier from the inside out. That green spaces in underserved neighborhoods weren't a luxury, but a language. A way of telling a community that it was worth investing in, worth tending, worth the long patiences of cultivation. He listened to every word. The following Monday, he came home at noon, hours earlier than usual, and came to find her in the conservatory. He sat across from her workbench and folded his hands on the surface and said, without preamble, I spoke with the board of Kong Industries this morning. Our philanthropic division is expanding. We are establishing an urban greening initiative, city gardens, community plots, school programs. We need a director. He paused. Someone with a proven understanding of cultivation, of building life in places that have been told they can't sustain it. Amara went very still. The role has its own office, he continued, his voice careful and even, its own budget, its own staff, its own mandate. You would report to no one but the board, and you would set your own direction. He held her gaze. It is a real position, Amara, real work, real impact. I am not offering you a title to keep you occupied. She looked at him for a long time. You built me a garden in the sky, she said slowly. Because I mentioned botany once, yes. And now you're offering me a career. I'm offering you what was already yours, he said simply. I'm just returning it. Her eyes burned. She blinked against it fiercely. You can't just give people back the things that were taken from them. I disagree, he said. I think that is precisely what power is for. She pressed both hands flat against the workbench surface. She looked at her plants. The orchid that had come back from the edge of dying, the climbing vine arching toward light, the ferns that had finally found their correct drainage and were, against every initial indication, thriving. She thought about the project she had buried under 6 years of survival. She thought about the neighborhoods she had mapped, the soil samples she had collected, the children she had imagined running between raised beds, full of tomatoes and sweet potato leaves, and the particular fierce green of things that grew where they'd been told they couldn't. Yes, she said. His expression didn't change. But something in his eyes did. A warmth, quiet and profound, that she had learned to recognize as the version of joy that lived in a man who had spent a long time believing he wasn't allowed to feel it. Good, he said. A year moved through them like weather. Amara launched her first urban garden in a neighborhood on the outskirts of Lagos that had been on the city's neglect list for a decade. A half-acre of reclaimed land, raised beds, a composting program, a partnership with 3 local schools. She stood on that soil on the opening morning, with her hands in her pockets and the early sun on her face, and watched children she didn't know yet run between the beds, with the particular reckless joy of children, discovering that the ground would give things up if you asked it correctly. She cried in her car on the way home. Happy tears, the kind she was still learning to recognize. A second garden followed, then a third. Her name started appearing in things. Community newsletters, a feature in a Lagos lifestyle magazine, a mention at a city council meeting. She built a small team, young women mostly, who had the same quality she recognized in herself, competence that had been practiced in private for years, waiting for someone to build a room large enough to put it in. Kang Jiseo watched all of it with a quiet, private pride that he expressed by never missing a single opening. Always standing somewhere in the back where she couldn't see him until it was over, always having read everything she had written about the project by the time she came home to tell him about it. She knew because she always tested him. What did you think of the composting model? And he always had an answer. A real one his world had steadied too. The rival faction that had grown bold in his perceived vulnerability had been dismantled with a thoroughness that the underworld registered the way. Weather registered a pressure front. You didn't see it happen, but you felt the atmosphere change. His position was more secure than it had been in years, not because he was harder, because for the first time, he was fighting for something specific. And specific things, Amara had learned from her plants, grew stronger than general ones. One evening in October, when the air had finally thinned towards something cooler and the conservatory was golden, with late light, he led her in by the hand and she stopped in the doorway. Candles. Dozens of them, small and flickering, arranged among the plants on every surface, on the workbench, the window ledge, along the floor, their light moving softly against the green leaves, turning the whole space into something warm and alive and sacred. In the center of the room, her small table set for two. "What is this?" she breathed. He turned to face her. And he smiled, the full one, the rare one, the one that transformed him entirely, and took both her hands in his. "Amara." His voice was different. Still quiet, still controlled, but underneath the control something had been removed, some final brace or buttress, leaving the thing itself exposed. "A year ago you came into my life as a transaction, something to be managed, something that happened to me." He squeezed her hands. "And then you grew a garden in my home. And you left tea at my door. And you told me the truth when I needed it, and gave me silence when I needed that. And you became—" He stopped, gathered himself. "You became the only reason any of this is worth the weight of it." Her eyes were blurring. He released one of her hands and reached into his jacket pocket and opened a small velvet box, and the ring inside caught the candlelight and scattered it across every surface in the room, tiny points of brightness landing in the leaves of the orchid she had coaxed back from nothing, in the petals of the jasmine, on her own hands, on his face. He stood before her straight and still. He did not kneel. He stood as her equal, her partner, the man who had chosen her as deliberately and completely as she had chosen him. "I am not asking you to be anything other than what you are," he said. "I am asking you to let me stand beside what you are, to build something with me that is larger and better than either of us managed alone." His voice dropped to almost nothing. "Marry me, Amara, not as a debt resolved, not as a woman rescued, as the person who saved me while I was busy thinking I was saving her." The tears came freely now. She did not wipe them away. She looked at this man, this dangerous, careful, complicated, extraordinary man, and she felt no obligation, no gratitude performing itself as love, no survival instinct dressed up in romantic language. She felt only the clean, uncomplicated truth of her own heart, which had made its decision slowly and carefully, and with full knowledge of what it was deciding. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. "Yes, Giseo." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, which she would remember later as the thing that did her completely. Not the ring itself, not the candlelight, not even the look on his face, but the simple, unlikely, perfect fit of it. Their wedding was held in the conservatory. There were no underworld figures, no associates, no display of power or connection. Noos sat in the front row in a dress the color of a summer evening and cried without embarrassment from the first word. Mr. Bake stood at the back with his arms folded and his expression carefully neutral and his eyes suspiciously bright. Amara wore cream, simple and clean and entirely hers. He wore dark gray and looked at her like she was every good thing he had ever not allowed himself to want, finally standing in front of him with permission. They had written their own vows. His were short. He was not a man of many words and never would be, which she loved about him. But every word was exact and irrevocable, the kind of language a man used when he had thought very carefully about what he was willing to be accountable to. Hers were longer. She told him that she had arrived in his life expecting a cage and found instead the first room that had ever felt large enough for her. She told him that he had given her back herself, not by rescuing her, but by creating the conditions in which she could do it on her own terms. She told him that she intended to spend the rest of her life growing things alongside him, in every sense of the word. When the simple gold band joined the diamond on her finger, he leaned down and whispered against her hair, "My sanctuary." She turned her face up to his. "My protector," she whispered back. Later, much later, after the quiet dinner and the soft laughter and Mrs. Nwosu's extraordinary food, they stood together at the window. The city below them glittered in its vast and indifferent beauty. She leaned her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her, steady and warm and certain. She thought about Raymond, somewhere distant, somewhere finished. A chapter that had closed so completely she could almost not locate it in herself anymore. He had tried to erase her by handing her to the thing he feared most. He had failed in the most complete way possible. The monster he had sold her to had turned out to be the first person who had ever looked at her and seen, beneath the damage, beneath the years of careful smallness, beneath all the ways she had learned to make herself less. A woman of extraordinary capacity, waiting for the conditions to grow. She was no longer his broken daughter. She was Amara, director, gardener, partner, wife. She was the woman who had cultivated life in a glass tower in the sky, and in doing so had cultivated it in a man who had forgotten it was possible. She was the queen who had been hiding, patient and enduring. Inside the pawn her father had sacrificed without a second thought. And she had not been found. She had found herself. The city burned below them, alive and endless, and she was not afraid of any of it.